Welcome to the final talk of Gentleness and Political Legitimacy, the Shambhala teachings on warrior kingship from a Western perspective. In this talk, I'm going to focus on the Shambhala teachings and look at some Shambhala texts and talk about how it's possible for gentleness to replace the notion of restraint as the key to good society. In Court Vision and Practice, which is Trungpa Rinpoche's primary text on government and kingship, gentleness, which we could also define as non-defensiveness, replaces restraint. Now, non-defensiveness is exercised by the king, who in the dualistic Western hero-king conflict is characterized by paranoia of the threats that he faces from people of worth. Restraint is characteristic of the hero in the dualistic system because military force can disrupt temporarily or permanently, and generally not for good, the entire society, unless that military force restrains itself. So we saw in the previous talk on Henry IV an example of military force that was used, at least so the story goes, for the good of the nation. In a brief period in which a notion like right by conquest seems to make some sense and seems to work for the society as a whole. But when we look more closely at that, we're probably going to find that it's not so simple. And at any rate, once again, we see the precariousness that the competition built into the dualistic system creates in society, when you have to have a warrior who's worried about his credentials, a king who's worried about his credentials, and so has to go to war in order to bolster them, as we see with Henry V. So in Court Vision and Practice, Trungpa Rinpoche says, the benevolent prince will understand the neuroses of his subjects and treat even the revolutionary spirits among them with great kindness. Gentleness is the best whip, one which everyone will respect. So here, first of all, he's using benevolence and gentleness exchangeably. And what he's saying here, if you look at the phrasing, even the revolutionary spirits among them, is he's emphasizing that the non-defensive quality of the Sakyang, or the Shambhala warrior king. Gentleness is the best whip, which is a phrasing that may be somewhat provocative, but nevertheless, what it says is that stability, harmony, finding a place for everyone in the kingdom will occur if non-defensiveness is practiced, even with respect to ambition, even with respect to those who would disrupt. And so there's got to be a way in which we have to see how this is practicable, and not just a matter of weakening institutions and creating opportunity for ambitious and rebellious members of society to take more power from themselves at the expense of others. So just to emphasize, this is a situation in which you have no heroic restraint. You have subjects who are described as neurotic and revolutionary spirits. That's to say that they've manifested something like a heroic claim, something like a challenge to authority or a challenge to procedural legitimacy. There's no heroic restraint. So gentleness is what Trungpa Rinpoche is recommending here. And that gets us back to our original three possibilities. Is that naive? So let's go through some of his other statements about this and see if we can sort of trace a line of thought that will establish why he doesn't think this is naive, or why we should not think this is naive. So Trungpa Rinpoche says that the prince is being powerful in the right way only when his command has a quality of all-pervasive influence, which is neither a threat nor a command. The command of the prince is powerful because it is gentle and heavy-handed at once. So there's some terms here which we're not going to be able to get to the bottom of, all-pervasive influence, and it's how that makes command heavy-handed. But it's really important to realize that neither a threat nor command. That's not saying it's neither this nor that. It's saying it's not this, and it's really not this, because threat and command are both fallen on the side of harshness. So the prince's command has to have a quality which is not a command, but it has to have gentleness. So again, let's just keep going through some of the thoughts in this section. Benevolence is something the prince must arouse in himself. It is the gentleness and non-aggression that he experiences in himself and from those around him that should make the prince kind and accommodating. And again, we're really emphasizing we're talking about a prince, and we're not preparing him to ward off threats. We're preparing him to accommodate them. So I think we can say that gentleness means, of course, in a non-dual context, not defending the position, because there's no way for the person to be identified with the position. Even the dualistic tradition recognizes that. It's just that it doesn't see a non-dual possibility of having people relate to positions without competing for them. Now, when gentleness is exercised, something is visible or something radiates. The heavy-handedness that we saw in the previous quote may be referring to what Trungpa Rinpoche called authentic presence. So this is a non-dual form of excellence that is revealed only in the absence of defensiveness or competition. So remember, we saw that excellence in the dualistic construction is promoted by competition. So if we take away competition, if we take away this sort of very literal hierarchical notion that your excellence can earn you a position, and then of course you have to be paranoid about someone taking it away from you, and so on and so forth, we're talking about a kind of excellence that isn't personal. So it gets back to the Rigdon chant, where you have he who is without beginning or end, who possesses the glory of tiger, lion, Garuda, dragon. These are non-dual qualities. They're personal qualities, but there's no person. So it's possible to have no defensiveness, no competition, if this form of non-dual excellence is present. And so that's a really important qualification here. And that's why when we saw the threat from the military in the Shambhala teachings, which is also in court vision and practice, we saw that the threat was based on the military officers having lost touch with their practice, with the meditation discipline, and with the Buddha Dharma altogether, have become cynical or lost their connection to it. So another supplication, another chant in the Shambhala tradition written by the Sakyang, the current Sakyang, states that, speaking of the Sakyang, his authentic presence reveals basic goodness. So it's gentleness is what allows authentic presence to radiate out, and authentic presence is communicating or revealing basic goodness, which is a quality that, again, is not possessible. It is not possessed by a person. But a person may have some quality of excellence in allowing basic goodness to radiate, but that's going to be characterized by non-defensiveness and non-competition. So we're now getting into the why is this not naive issue. Until the prince is genuine, he cannot claim his command at all. In this context, genuineness means knowing what is right, whether he were prince or not. So again, there's an impersonal understanding of the self. A genuineness is a revealing. Genuineness is an ability to allow, and not an accomplishment or an accumulation or taking of anything or a defending of anything. So heroism or warriorship or personal worth or excellence, we're starting to use these interchangeably, is allowed to shine forth. And what's key is it's the Sakyang's job is not to tell it how it should shine forth. So that's a really important point, is that excellence shines forth according to its own light. And it's not my job to tell my excellence or my basic goodness how to shine forth. There's again a quality of allowing. It doesn't need to be placed into a hierarchy. It doesn't, this is the right way, this is the wrong way, this expression is better, this expression is worse. It doesn't need that. We don't need to fight off expressions of basic goodness or excellence or personal worth. We don't need to classify them. So this isn't something that an individual does. This is not something that the Sakyong does and that takes care of everything. The success of Shambhala politics depends on underlying equality or worthiness. It's a kind of a fabric that everyone is part of. So society as a whole has to have an ethos of gentleness as strength, and an understanding, however, crude or on the popular music level, that only gentleness allows basic goodness to shine. So a society-wide practice and ethos of gentleness would be the point that we would be trying to accomplish as Shambhalians, not demanding, for instance, that one single person must be gentle. Certainly not demanding that in a very aggressive way. Now, no matter how gentle the Sakyong is, we're still practicing in a dualistic society. We're still practicing Shambhala in a dualistic society, and we're constituting our little Shambhala game world in that society, and we bring with us what we were raised with. We bring the society in with us. So the king must allow authentic presence, must allow excellence to shine according to its own light. But he has to be careful, and it's not entirely up to him, not to be understood as picking favorites and saying, your skills make you more worthy. I don't think we've done that very well. I think that's a big flaw in Shambhala, both in terms of how recognition is understood and received and how it's given out in Shambhala. The criteria for holding positions cannot imply or create a hierarchy of personal worth out of excellence in specific skills. And we've already talked about this in other contexts earlier in this series, that there's this notion that there's such a thing as personal worth or excellence in specific skills, but it's not one person being more worthy than another. So what can we do right now? Well, another word for gentleness is vulnerability. So not defending the position is opening ourselves up. And not defending the position includes not defending our mood, not defending, it's the whole gamut of things that we know as practitioners. We don't necessarily all manifest the qualities of an enlightened Sakyong. We have to recognize that. We have to recognize that we don't all have the same level of confidence in basic goodness. We are easily shaken out of it. We don't all have the same level of ability to be gentle or to allow authentic presence to radiate. But we can all practice vulnerability, and we can all live with the consequences of that. And that will actually be radiating basic goodness. Because if we weren't practicing vulnerability, we wouldn't have confidence in basic goodness. And if we are practicing vulnerability, we could be naive. But more likely what people are going to understand, if we're doing it in a genuine way, is that there's a certain strength there. So the ruling principle becomes visible in our vulnerability. So for the moment, Shambhala is hard to find. The organization that's described so vividly in books like, or talks of the Vidyadhara, like Court Vision and Practice, for instance, is not really there. And at the same time, it's not any less relevant than it ever was. In fact, it's probably more relevant. The Western political model, the crisis in the Western political model, which was there from the beginning and is even acknowledged in its own sort of pessimism, is now more evident than ever. And Shambhala offers a real way out of the doomed conundrum of the Western approach to the hero-king split. So the hero-king split is the core problem of Western society. The notion of competition, the notion of not being able to let go, all the things that we talk about as Buddhist practitioners. And Shambhala has placed those in a very bold foreground by talking about these in the context of rulership. So we have something really powerful to offer. And the relevance of Shambhala depends on us, on our ability as Shambhala to manifest and propagate the notion of gentleness. And whatever basic goodness we have, whatever confidence in basic goodness we are able to shine out and to reveal, is our contribution. So I have some final notes that I want to tack on here at the end. I think this is pretty clear. As I said, I was going to sort of run through these terms and have them acquire more and more meaning so that we understood that I'm not necessarily talking about just a military hero or military warrior when I say hero. And I hope that's become clear at this point. Think of Joseph Campbell, his use of the term hero. I think in the dualistic context, the everyone is a hero notion still has a competition quality. It's the full competitively realized individual in any field or area of human endeavor. You have to find your field, but you have to compete there. And you have to achieve some sense of success. Your excellence does not consist in connecting to pre-existing basic goodness or excellence. So there's an everybody is a hero notion that goes along with the dualistic context. And I'm talking about that when I'm talking about dualistic politics. But also I want to make clear that there's a non-dual criticism of that, and that what we really mean by everyone is a hero is that everyone has basic goodness. I have talked about these ideas to a small number of people, and one question I got was, what do you make of the fact that the Sakyong is described as celestially or heaven appointed? So that's almost the first thing that's said in Court Vision and Practice, and after the forewords. So I'll read you the quote and I'll come back to it in a second. The Sakyong is celestially or heavenly appointed. This is another way of saying that along with his great vision, a Sakyong must also possess great sanity. When he possesses great sanity, his notion of boundaries begins to dissolve and his vision expands, and so on and so forth. So, first of all, if that's a literal divine right claim, which I think you see, and we'll go over it again in the second part of the quote, it's not. If it is, then it's typical of procedural legitimacy. It's certainly typical of monarchs to claim divine right or divine descent or descent from the sun. And it's also typical of democratic leaders. When you get elected, you have some sort of power that's way beyond what a mere majority of voters would suggest. You have power over those who voted for you and against you. And so constitutional election, procedural legitimacy confers something that could almost be called magic or supernatural. Now, because the tradition, this is a tradition of warriorship in Shambhala, something is different. The normally procedural claim of divine right, which goes along with non-warrior rulers, is actually defined in terms of personal qualities, which goes along with warrior rulers or warriors generally. So ruling on the basis of personal qualities is the dualistic thing that happens and turns into the heroic claim. So here, what the quote went on to say after the Sakyong is celestially or heavenly appointed was translating that normal divine right claim into personal qualities. This is another way of saying that along with his great vision, a Sakyong must also possess great sanity. So this is actually not a claim to rule, but a description of personal qualities. And in other words, this statement should not be understood as referring to any person's inborn or some other type of right to the throne. It just prescribes necessary ruling qualities. Necessary in the sense that they will develop as a result of ruling through gentleness, or necessary in the sense that in order to do this kind of ruling, one must have developed these qualities. One must have practiced and had a lot of blessings. So another note, that the Sakyong need to uphold high personal moral standards like honesty, courage, etc. I just want to sort of like, again, I think people get this already, but when you use the word personal, you can see where I'm going. Yes, but the requirement that the Sakyong needs to uphold high personal moral standards is not a requirement of his being the Sakyong and holding that seat as a procedural ruler, especially if he's appointed to that seat. That requires something totally unrelated to personal morality. I think when we talk about the regent, certain personal moral flaws do seem to rise to the level of invalidating his procedural claim. But I'm not even sure in that case that that's really what's happening. There can be revulsion for a person of deficient morality as a person, but that's different from saying they've lost their legal claim. And I'll get to the current occupant of the White House in a second. So as a warrior, you're making a claim based on your personal worth, and generally that's going to involve moral standards. There are warriors who claim based on ferocity and how terrifying they are, but that's not really what we mean by the heroic claim. That devolves on someone based on some combination of qualities, which include a sort of civic mindedness. In Shambhala, where the warrior and the king claim are united, the ruler must be careful about the standards he promotes and how he lives up to them, because warriorship is a part, a hyphenated part, but a part of his definition as a ruler. But it's not fundamentally his claim. So that leads us to Trump. And again, we're going to see that there's a sort of predictability to this, which I find reassuring. So Trump's claim, as we've said, is threadbare procedural claim, the Electoral College. It's not a heroic claim by any means. It doesn't extend broadly. There's some sort of performative legitimacy claim associated with the stock market, but even there you have sort of like balancing out economic problems, certainly right now. His personal morality does not directly affect his legitimacy. That depends entirely on the Electoral College and support from or control of the other institutions of government, because he could have been impeached, but he wasn't. So to the extent that he makes claims about his personal worth, and to the extent there are people who support him on the basis of those claims, he does risk losing legitimacy. But to the extent that neither he nor his supporters are really that worried about his personal morality, they're still going to vote for him, and that may be enough to ensure his legitimacy, along with all the other things that are going on to make sure that the vote goes in his direction. Now, I think it'd be really interesting. People talk about how he's not going to step down. I think that's really unlikely. I think that's extremely unlikely. I think you have someone who's wouldn't have, that would be making a heroic claim. And I think that there's enough of a sort of innate sense that you can't support a heroic claim if it isn't made by someone who at least has some heroic credentials. Certainly you're seeing that among the military right now. I don't think that's not something that worries me. Just sort of as a kind of I Ching thing, like that's just not the way things work out in the cards. I could be wrong. It is not in his interest, at any rate, to hold himself to high moral standards, because that would invoke a sense that he's claiming to rule on the basis of personal worth, which he doesn't have. He wants to make sure that the vote, the Electoral College, is the basis of his claim, because that's the only thing he can be sure of. So that concludes this last talk. It concludes this series. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's stimulated some thought, and especially I hope it's inspired some sense that the Shambhala teachings are relevant, powerfully relevant today. I hope you can find some way to exercise gentleness and vulnerability that maybe you hadn't thought of before, and find some energy for that. If you want to make comments, I'd love to hear what you think. I'd love to get your questions and respond to them. The comments in the if you're watching this on YouTube are moderated, and so comments won't be visible right away, and depending on what you write, they may never be visible. But I'd really like to read what everyone has to say, if there's anyone who watches this. Thank you very much for joining me on this journey. I hope you found it worthwhile.